Hello everybody and welcome to what is the 68th edition of the Frankenstein chats. So these weekly chats occur and we post them online, and I'm pleased to say we have a guest with us this morning. So hello Fiona.
Hello, good morning. How are you in Manchester?
Yeah, very well. Yeah, and I've just heard that the test match has been cancelled or postponed or whatever it is. So for a cricket fan, that's very, very disappointing news. But anyway, Stan, how are you this morning?
I'm good this morning in sunny Salford. The rain seems to have gone from last night's downpour, so yeah, it looks good. I'll be on the roof fixing the shed.
Right, Fiona, can you just introduce yourself, tell people who you are and
so I'm a journalist and I write about education, mostly for The Guardian, and I'm also a school governor, and I spent a period working in the Labour government between 1997 and 2003, so that was a bit of a diversion away from my career in journalism. So I've got quite a mixed bag of a career. Like a lot of women with children, I've done quite a lot of different things.
Yeah, and actually, just so I met Fiona a few years ago, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, at a dinner, and we chatted, and we did commit to trying to meet up, but then sort of things like the pandemic got in the way of things. So I've kept in touch with her, and I'm really grateful that she's joined us today. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, well, let's start then. Let's go to Stan first then. What's caught your eye this week, Stan?
Hi, Frank. Well, for me, because it's personal, it's the social care plan announcement, which sounded as though in the build up to it was going to be the answer to everyone who's got parents or relatives in care and are having to pay for them. It sounded as though at last somebody's going to sort this out. The detail seems to be completely the opposite now. At the moment, if you've got 20 assets of 23,500, you don't have to pay for your care. The local authority picks up the bill. In the new scheme, that drops to 20,000, and there's an additional cost that you'll be asked to contribute to, which is what they describe as hotel costs, which is your sort of food and accommodation, etc. So what looked like was going to be a great solution now looks like it's a bit of a mess. It doesn't look like it's been thought through properly, because if everybody's paying pay the maximum 86,000, I don't think care homes can run on that, because at the moment, full payers, most people pay and pay more than the local authorities pay, and if you take that extra money away, I don't know how they're going to run. And the cost of them, the first home my mother went in after hospital, we didn't choose it, she was placed there to recover, was £1,000 a week. Well, if you, like my mother, have a small terraced house and sufficient savings to get by, but no great order, you lose your house within a year. Basically. And that's not going to change.
No, I mean, so I went to the dentist yesterday, and I was talking to the dentist about all of this, and I was making the point about national insurance not being a really fair way of taxing, and he basically said, I don't really understand it. I thought, actually, you're a dentist and you run a business. Actually, you're ending up having to pay for this as a business. And I was thinking, wow, the dentist doesn't understand it. So it made me think about the average person. The points you're making here, Stan, this will go right over the head of the vast majority of people, because it doesn't affect them directly, does it? And it's quite complicated, so it just sort of pushes away.
And it sounds like, that we've, after so many governments have been unable to solve it, we've got this great plan. And of course, like every other plan we've seen recently, it's just a line. There's nothing beyond it.
Fiona, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, quite a lot, including that last, obviously the issue about social care. But I think the something I read last night, and I think in one of the papers, was an account from an Italian fisherman of somebody who was prosecuted for bringing asylum seekers in, saving asylum seekers at sea, about what it's like when you're in this dark, in the middle of the ocean, middle of the night, and you hear somebody crying for help, and there is a child there. How difficult it is. It's not a black and white decision to say, oh, it's just easy, I'm going to ignore them and send them back, or allow them to, fall into the sea, try and escape and lose their life. And I think this story about returning the asylum seekers back has really upset me quite a lot. I can understand all the political arguments for it, and it's the posturing that goes on around it. But in the end, this is a human issue about real human beings. And it really brought it home to me what it's like. I felt, well, I'd really like Priti Patel to go out on one of those boats in the middle of the night and listen to a child crying and say, fine, you just throw yourself overboard rather than be sent back to France or whatever.
But in a way, it shows a bit of a breakdown, doesn't it? I mean, Brexit is somewhere in this, isn't it? Because actually that breakdown with the French and our sort of, in effect, our relationship with our nearest partners, is at the heart of all of this, and actually working collaboratively with our neighbours, which would seem so much easier when
we're. That's a very old-fashioned concept, Frank.
Yeah.
Very old-fashioned concept. This is very last century, this idea that we work with people. We have to go on our own and be better than everybody else.
The thing is, though, is that this global Britain, we cannot move the country into a different part of the world, can we? We are where we are, sort of thing. It's not as if these neighbours are going to be our neighbours forever. This idea that they're not there, and actually we can jump over them. This proves that we can't do that. We need them as much as they need us. This in a way is a sort of a realization of the fact that there is no wall, that we have to work with them and we have to be welcoming.
There's also no real analysis or understanding of why. Why do they want to come here? Why don't they want to stop in France? The reasons behind that are quite complicated, but until we understand those reasons, I suspect we won't really tackle this problem properly.
Yeah. And what's caught my eye this week is the news that came out, I think, from the TS, I think it was released this morning, although I got wind of it yesterday, was that there is something called the National Reference Test, which is undertaken, I think it's been taken for the last 4 or 5 years, which is taken at various year groups in secondary school and enables, in a way, it's the same test, so you can actually get a sense of where standards are. I suppose at the end of the day, if you were to get rid of all national tests, it proves how few students you need to actually test to get a sense of how well the country is doing. But it's 60 students from 350 schools. That's all it's going to take. Now, that's undertaken every year. And particularly over the last 2 years, it was done in 2020, but it has been undertaken in 2021. It's managed by Ofqual, but significantly, private schools have not been included this year. And bearing in mind the highest grade inflation in the national exams has been in private schools, it's deeply concerning that Ofqual, because they've not done that, will not be able to explain why there has been this grade inflation. Is it real, or is it because there's been external pressure from various sources on those schools to actually give higher grades? But we will never know now.
I'm interested in that story because I was under the impression that the point of the national reference test was to get to a sort of baseline way of, ending grade inflation in the process of moving from the old grades and the old GCSEs to the new GCSEs. That's what I thought it was for. And it seems to be a very sensible idea. And eventually you could use it as a way of moving slightly away from exams being the... So my immediate reaction would be, well, it's been invalidated. If they're not doing it correctly and scientifically, then
yes,
has to be a basis for anything. And I think people ought to be asking questions about that.
It's interesting because the results for 2020 showed that there was very little difference between previous years in English, but in mathematics there was a it continued the trend of higher grades over the last few years. But as you say, it would have been possible to identify if there was a problem within the private sector, but actually we'll never know that now.
Well, it's the problem, and as a journalist, I can tell you that what is a real problem is you hear these phrases being thrown around like, oh, standards have gone up or standards have gone down since. That is you can't even say that because every single form of assessment has changed so much in the last 30 years. You're not comparing like with like. So until you have a standardized test, you can't really make a judgment of whether standards, whatever they are, have improved. It's a meaningless concept.
Yeah,
and to go back to so many other stories about education, including the one that I've been writing about this week, these exams are at the bedrock of absolutely everything about our school system, how schools behave, how they're viewed, how they're treated by the government. And in fact, they're built on sand. We know that. And this reference test was one way, I think, of ensuring that there was some fairness and stability in the system.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to sort of, I mean, you have been writing this week about events in a London academy, haven't you?
I've done 2 stories now, and I've been working on them both for about 3 months. It's been very, very painstaking process. And if you want, I won't name the school, but it's a very high-profile school with a lot of high-profile parents. And as a governor of other London schools, I can tell you it's one of those schools that is held up to us. Is if they can do it with that sort of intake, why can't you do it? Well, I now know why we can't do it, because the schools I've been involved with are broad, very, very inclusive, and try very hard to keep students in and support them whatever their backgrounds and needs. Of course, don't get the most brilliant progress aids or results.
No.
Or as good as some other schools where the heads are prepared to play a totally different game. It just makes my blood absolutely boil. And in this particular school, stuff has been going on there for years, and it's been inspected serially by Ofsted, who keep finding it outstanding. And it clearly isn't outstanding. It's some pretty bad things are going on there. So it's made me really wonder how the accountability system can be judged to be working if that's allowed to continue.
Interestingly, Fiona, in the work I do with the Northern Powers Partnership, we produced a fair elite table, which basically drew on the work of Dr. George Leckie, going back to a contextual value added. Now, I know there's research come out recently which sort of discredits some of that, but the point I want to make is that we also looked at numbers of students going in and coming out of some of the highest performing northern schools on the government's league table. And we decided not to publish those results this year, because actually it was going to deflect away from what was some fantastic achievement by schools that are not the government's, sort of hot school that we want to go and promote. These are solid schools that are making really good progress with their kids. But actually it's quite shocking seeing the proportion of students that are leaving some of these schools. So we know the numbers. You would have thought a high performing school would have everybody wanting to come and join it. In a way it's sort of intuitive, isn't it, that you'd want them to come.
I can say, having worked in an authority where we had what I would describe as a toxic mat that the government would regard as a very, very high performing one, that it wasn't the parents' choice or the student's choice to leave the school.
Yes.
It was the school's choice. And the other bit of data that we never got our heads around, which I would love to do, would be to look at the number of SEN children at year 6 who didn't appear in year 7 at their feeder secondary school, because there was a lot of pressure on parents to move their children, or to self-educate them, or to move them to a school that was more suitable. And that was like already setting up the academy to do better by removing the special needs children, which might affect their results in the future.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that culture is set though, isn't it, by the trustees or the governing body or whatever. In a way, I remember leading the Carb Academies Trust. I was not a trustee. I didn't have a vote. We had a head teacher and a member of staff on as trustees, who the trust board appointed those, but people applied. Anybody could apply, and I felt as though I was the highest paid person in the trust, but I was actually accountable to them. And actually I felt as I was really seriously challenged at times, where I thought, oh gosh, I'm not sure that I'm going to keep this going, which was, I think, really, really positive, because they were challenging me regularly about culture and about ethos and about and not just about, well, the GCSE results. But it seems as though at times when we were trying to do more and trying to help schools, the rules the terms of engagement we were engaged in were completely at odds at times with the terms of engagement that the DFE and Regional Schools Commissioner were pursuing. And so we had to work even harder to convince people that what we were doing was the right thing, because it didn't seem to sort of rattle their bell at all. What we were. In the
case I was involved with, we drew attention to the Regional Schools Commission about the number of exclusions, very high exclusions at this particular academy, and the answer in one line was, well, they get good results.
Yeah.
No further comment.
It's interesting, off-rolling is in here, isn't it? There's also something around off-rolling that Ofsted have revealed yesterday, that there are a number of inspection reports where off-rolling or inspection for off-rolling was identified, but inspectors didn't call it off-rolling. And those schools then have said, well, you know, in public statements, well, Ofsted didn't find any off-rolling. Well, they did, but they didn't use the term off-rolling. And going back to that fairer, that Northern Powers Partnership stuff, that we read the reports are undertaken by a very, very small number of MATs were inspected, you know, to investigate off-rolling. It felt as though the intention was not to upset too many people through this process, because again, I don't want to mention the MAT, but actually, if I share that MAT report about off-rolling, you think actually you have been off-rolling, but actually nobody wants to reveal it, you know. So
do
couched in very strange language. Do
let me have it off the record, because I think if I feel the next piece I want to write is a broader one, because since my first piece about this school appeared, I've been contacted by so many people. I hate to say it, all in academies, none in maintained schools, about the culture in their schools. And it seemed that obviously there's something about the accountability of academies that's too weak and allows this thing to continue. But I think there is a piece to be written more generally, 20 years on from the whole academy process starting, about, the weaknesses in the system that some of us were concerned about right at the start. Of course, got our heads bitten off the saying, but it's really not good enough that it allows too much power and abuse of power in the hands of a small number of people if they don't have good governance. But also Ofsted doesn't really seem to nobody seems to look at the governance very closely.
No, it's amazing how many schools.
I'll just give you one final example about the school yesterday, which is the one I wrote about. It's about the students and a group of ex-students coming forward and saying the terrible experience they'd had at school, being off-roll, their mental health being ignored, inappropriate relationships with teachers. This is in an outstanding school. They've written 3 times to the chair of governors, and she hasn't even replied to their letter.
Right.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
They just don't care. They just think, we'll put our heads down, this will pass by, the results will carry on going, being good, the DfE won't give us any trouble, and so why do we need to do anything?
But there's an arrogance about their closeness with the DfE, because certainly I had conversations where I was told, well, we'll listen to what you've got to say, but one word from me and I can do that through the DfE without a problem. And it's used as a threat. When you're a local authority and you haven't got control, but you have got influence, because technically you're still responsible for the academic progress of those children.
Absolutely.
Even though you've no control over that. But as soon as you start to challenge, there's just this, well, we'll talk directly to the DfE.
And that goes nowhere.
The other thing was, I mean, this is what it triggers things, this conversation, isn't it? But wasn't it recently, and I think there's a concern here for me about the head teacher unions, Ofqual, NHT, the CST, got together with some of the larger, more favoured multi-academy trusts to write directly to the department, to the government, about a particular matter. The matter means nothing really. It's the irrelevance of the matter. It's the fact that that group of MATs have such a position that they actually sort of infiltrate into and cozy up with not just the government, but with other parties that you think, well, actually, you should be keeping your distance here, but actually everyone's in this sort of mix. And I do recall when I was the CEO of the co-op, somebody called me from a group that were trying to create I can't remember the name of it now, but like a club. And I refused to join the CEO club. But actually, the thing is that CEO club feels as though it's still alive and kicking, And for me, I think it'd be wrong. I personally feel as though there are many more. I know many more multi-academy trusts that are doing a really good job.
Oh yeah, I don't doubt that at all.
And I do.
I think you're
I also want to go back to saying what we mustn't do is think that the local authorities, because I used to be responsible for Ofsted's inspection of local authorities, that the scrutiny committees at local authority, at council level, they were appalling. It was as much a surprise that the councillors knew how many schools they had, let alone how many had failed their Ofsteds or whatever. So I think that there is something here about trying to flush out what those features of weak governance, weak leadership are.
I think you know, you talk about, I totally agree with you about weak local authorities, but there's something about the way the academies are set up that allows the people who run them to feel they have power, that maintain school heads don't feel they have. They're paid a hell of a lot more money.
Yeah.
I mean, the head of this school is paid £280,000 a year for running one single school. He's only got one school in the trust. He's paid more per pupil than anybody else. And that's not good either. And just to go back to your point about the club, I mean, I think the problem for the teacher unions and so on is that they will know that their way of getting heard politically in government is to be allied to, so it's a purely pragmatic decision on their part. If they come along with 5 of the most popular, well-loved academy trusts, they're more likely to get a hearing in government than if they don't. I understand.
Yeah. But actually, I think though, thinking about it as I'm not a member of any of those, but if I was a member, I would really be wanting to push back now and say, okay, you've got the voice heard, but it's again who you're choosing as your friends. You know, I really feel as though that isn't, to me, that doesn't feel as though that's the right place for them to be in. The right space for them to be in.
I suppose, Frank, though, you're at a point, we're at a point certainly in secondary where probably more staff are in academies than they are in maintained schools, and so their members are mostly from I'm guessing that I'd say that'd be different in primary, but in secondary I guess that the majority of their members are in academies, and therefore that's where they need to be influencing.
And we still have CEOs who are trustees. But that at the end of the day, you know, this is about, if we have the academy system, we cannot have people with so much power. We've got I think we've still got members who are CEOs. You know, I mean, and actually some of these are the highest paid. And obviously, if you're a member and a trustee,
and a governor,
you've got incredible power over what happens. You know, even if you wanted to give yourself £400,000 salary, you know, you're probably going to choose your mates very carefully on that board. I mean, no matter what the government has said, what the ESFA have done, it has not prevented, you know, large pay rises. There have been some reductions, but still people are still earning, you know, significant sums of money for the job they're doing.
And in the early stages of MATs being formed, and I do mean in the early stages, you could spot the people, the heads at the time who were moving into becoming CEOs, etc., who were doing it for the community or doing it for themselves, and you could have almost put them in 2 boxes.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, I do agree with you. I think the majority of MAT CEOs, academy principals, are very good people who share all the values, the heads of the schools that I'm involved with. But the trouble is that if they don't want to be like that, the potential exists for them to get away with it. And I think between the DFE, Ofsted and the Regional Schools Commission, about which I know very little really, because I've always been a governor in a maintained school, you know, it's too weak. It's just too weak. The structure is, the system of accountability is too weak.
Well, it's interesting. This week I heard, I think at the Select Committee, talking about using the regional schools commissioners as a vehicle for instigating change over a matter, without really understanding that if you're not an academy, then the regional schools commissioner's control over you is very, very thin. You know, unless you fail your inspection, you know, your dealings with the regional schools commissioner are, you never go to a meeting with them. You're not held to, you know, by them. The local authority might be, but you personally are not as a board or as a head teacher.
I mean, the system as it's been created is an absolute mess, and I don't think anybody's got the political will or indeed understanding to unpick it and put it back together in a way that's coherent. But it just isn't coherent at all.
No. So I had a lot of sympathy with the initial, it's the converter academies. Which are the problem for me. The sponsored academies were an attempt to try and inject additional expertise and resources into schools that had consistently struggled, and that's how the co-op got involved in the academy program. But actually, as soon as the apparent freedoms were then not being afforded to what were deemed to be more successful schools, everybody wanted a bit of the action. And I think
they offered a lot of money. They were.
Yeah. And I think the issue here is around, be interesting to track that back, because actually I think that more in the converter side of things, it'd be interesting to see if there is some rottenness around, where it sits now. Whether or not this is about people going into
I'm not sure.
what
Remember the Durand Academy? Remember the Durand Academy?
Yeah,
I mean, I've covered a lot of these stories over the years, and some of them were in sponsored academies. There were schools that were in very deprived areas. I mean, my issue with this is it wasn't necessary to set up the academy structure to do all the things you say had to be done. You could have done it within the maintained structure.
Definitely.
And once you made that thing available, it was open to a lot of abuse, and that's what's happened, because the Department for Education was never going to be able to run thousands of schools from Whitehall. But that's effectively what we set up. But anyway, I don't know, it's a big political question for education policy about how you grow back from that, especially at a time of the impact of the pandemic now is so great that all sorts of other problems are going to be pushed to the margins, aren't they, while people struggle with this widening gap. And how I think that's going to be the defining story, probably, as Kevin Collins rightly recognised, for the next 10 years.
Yes.
Well, when I've spoken to governors, though, of maintained schools who are considering becoming academies because it seems to be the way to go, they've no concept of the fact that they basically all they're doing is giving their school away, their authority away. They won't be governors in most mats. They won't have a role to play, and they still got this view that they as a group will be running the school, but without the local authority, interfering. And it's really, those kind of autonomy that were offered when it first started disappeared, 5 years ago?
Well, I mean, because I think the COP was one of the few trusts that actually had the sort of umbrella arrangement at the start, didn't it? So schools could keep their own legal status but be part of a bigger organisation. Now you have to basically become like a franchise of Tesco if you want to join an academy trust, and that people don't understand the difference between that. You lose all your freedoms, and you're just dependent on the powers that are delegated to the school, aren't you? They can be substantial, but they can be very minimal.
The thing is, if you're not driven by sort of honourable values and principles, then actually they're up for sale, aren't they? There's nothing that's going to stick you to those through the dark days. And actually, I think that there are the significant shifts that occur when CEOs change roles as well. So you get a new CEO. The vibration that occurs in these trusts is significant, because they're really not driven by those sort of, they're not embedded, those values and principles are not as well embedded as they ought to be.
But in terms of autonomy, I spoke to a head who'd resigned, and what she said to me was, I've been head of 3 successful schools. No one's going to tell me where I buy exercise books from. and that was the level. And if you think back through the years, the whole thing of making schools independent was to get away from local authorities doing that, having to ask permission to buy a stamp.
It's worse in some of the academic changes. It's much worse than being in a local authority.
And I would say, I'm not just because I'm a great fan of the COP, to be honest, but the local authority are one of the key partners in that trust. So it's not about doing it outside of the local authority.
I think the COP was an exceptional model that could have been used as a model for other all over the country, but for whatever reason, politicians chose not to use that model and wanted to go for something that was more entrepreneurial and, I think less values driven. And I think that's really a shame. But that looking at how the Co-op's done it is one way forward. I think if you wanted to bring a coherence to the system, you could have re-academized on that basis, where people had to have, it had to be set up in a certain way in collaboration with the local authority.
It's going to be very hard to rein it back, though, isn't it? It's going to be so costly. It's cost a lot of money to get to where we are. And as you said before, the focus is going to be somewhere else. Do you know what? That's
back, because I remember schools saying, well, if we don't like it, we can always vote with our feet. No, there is no way back.
Most people didn't understand from the start what it meant. I know you want to wrap up, but I was phoned by a lawyer in about 2006, 6 said, look, I've got to talk to you because this is what it actually means legally, and nobody understands it. And that's the stars really fell from my eyes completely then, because he said, this is the volume of education law that I have to deal with as a lawyer for maintained schools. Then he pulled out this little book and said, and this is the volume of education law that applies to academies. Now, over time, that's changed with the model funding agreements and so on. But in the end, nobody really understood the legal basis for what the academy programme was, which was a fully independent institution within the state system.
Yeah. Hey, can I ask you, Fiona, has anyone on your governing body suggested that your schools become an academy?
No.
Is that because they
We have
know
a
that?
very strong local authority. The schools work closely together. We've got no special measures or RI schools. Most of the schools are good or outstanding. It's worked very well for us. And it's also, you know, in North London, you know, people don't like those sorts of arrangements.
Yeah.
But we have got an academy that was imposed upon the borough. And there've been a few free schools have opened because of you know, pupil need, but no, I think so I've got a totally different experience.
Yeah.
Most of the rest of the country, and they're both secondary schools, the schools I've been involved with. So
well, in the authority that I was working with the secondaries, almost every secondary was an academy, but the people, the principals involved kept themselves together as a team. And were happy to work with the local authority. That they were aware that there was a gap between us, and we weren't instructing them to do things, but we were there and worked with them on a number of projects.
And that's the same in Blackpool, where I'm the independent chair of the Education Improvement Board there. I think what's happened is local authorities are, certainly Blackpool's really good at saying, hang on a minute, these are Blackpool kids.
Yeah. That's,
you know, so that voice of the local authority and has brought people together. So there's only 8 secondaries, so it's a nice.
Yeah, I think it's a really important way of looking at it. And the problem with the story I've been writing about this week is, as far as I can see, the local authority doesn't see the kids in that school as their responsibility.
Right.
They're two-handed up with this, with the head and the school. And politically, it's, you know, wouldn't be good. You know, they want to stay in, and for all sorts of reasons. That Michael Gove's son is a pupil of the school, just amongst other things. So, but I think if you think about it in terms of the children rather than institutions, that's a much healthier way of looking of making your arrangements locally.
Yeah, and I think that certainly where in the north, it's been refreshing seeing what work schools that were competing with each other come together during the pandemic, just to sort of try and help each other out. And what we're trying to do is to just build on that sort of level of cooperation. Yeah. Okay, look, that's nearly 35 minutes. So thank you very much. It goes so quickly. It's been a pleasure having you as a guest today, Fiona. And thank you.
Well, I think it's good we've raised an important topic that slid off the agenda, really. So
good. And Stan, I'll see you next week. We might be recording a bit later next week because Stan's away on a residential.
In my role as a governor, I've been asked, would I, because the staff are the shortage of staff because of COVID, will I go to an outdoor ed centre with
great. Lovely. Well, at least they're up and running again, because they were shut for ages, weren't they?
Yes and no, but in my previous life I was line manager to these outdoor ed centres that we're going to, and have had times when I've had to speak to members of staff that will now be hauling me off trees. And
you're not camping. Are you camping?
No, it's a fabulous, believe it or not, built 5 years ago. I think it cost 5-6 million. It's an absolutely beautiful outdoor ed centre on the shores of Windermere.
Oh, wow.
When we designed it, we even had groups of parents of children with all kinds of difficulties, and used them to say how we should design. So for some autistic parents, they said that they needed a room that was away from other people, because when their children scream all night, it puts other, it causes problems. So we were even able to make rooms that converted from individual rooms to a bedroom, bathroom, living room, which autistic children could stay at a different level. So, it was amazing.
I'm jealous. I wish I was going to the outdoor next week. I hope the sun shines for you.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how warm Windermere will be.
Anyway, okay, well, we'll be back next week to see you all. We might be a bit later recording, but we'll be able to find out Stan's exploits as he abseils down from a tree from a member of staff he might have reprimanded in the past. But anyway, good luck with that, Stan, and thank you, Fiona.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, I've lost her.